Okay, welcome to a special little session of our Organizing the Green New Deal class. So last night we had to move quickly through the last section where I was presenting last night, mostly because we just ran over time a little bit. And I ran through a lot of content that I don't feel really comfortable moving through at the pace that I did. And so I wanted to record something much similar. It's very similar to last night, but allowing for some examination of some of the concepts and some greater explanation of how the framework that I was working with applies to thinking within a Green New Deal. So call this mini lecture, I guess, the Capitalocene and a Just Transition. My name is Nick Caleb. I'm the climate and energy attorney at Breach Collective. And prior to joining Breach, I was the staff attorney at the Center for Sustainable Economy, and I previously worked at the city of Portland as a climate energy staffer, and then also at our Children's Trust, and was an adjunct professor at a school called Concordia for a long time, teaching geography, environmental sciences, and American government classes. My work primarily involves fossil fuel infrastructure resistance and promotion of renewables and sort of green New Deal type transition thinking. So I've been reading a lot of work from this guy called Jason Moore, who's a professor at Binghamton University. He is, I think his day job is sociologist, but he's a world ecologist, and it's an area of study that's sort of like world systems theory and Marxism put together, I guess, if you study or think of either of those things. And we were hoping to have him as a speaker at the class, but he wasn't able to make it for scheduling reasons. So, but I think his framework is really interesting for thinking about ecology in general, but definitely about the system that we live under and how things to think about as we imagine a different system, so as to not replicate the same problems with our current system, which we'll call capitalism for the purposes of this discussion. And importantly, Moore's work, and I think I agree with this, that capitalism is not just an economic system, it's a social, economic, and environmental system. It's a whole world system, essentially. And to break it up in these little pieces where we measure value in some places and not others, this is a part of the tools and the language of the system, but it doesn't really capture how the system actually works. And so getting an understanding of how capitalism works is really, really important for thinking about, if you're sort of a moderate thinker, how you can maybe use these tools toward better outcomes. And if you're, maybe an abolitionist or a Marxist or a eco-socialist or anything else, thinking about what kind of transition we might make and how. So I'll be sampling from several of Moore's works with some quotes and ideas and concepts, and then talking about some big transitions that I see happening in the economy overall, the global economy, and especially as it relates to fossil fuels. And then we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about some alternative ways of, let's say, managing nature resources and humans that might be more in line with human rights than capitalism is. So I'm going to read this quote to start. The story of humanity and nature conceals a dirty secret of modern world history. That secret is how capitalism was built on excluding most humans from humanity, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, nearly all women, and even many white-skinned men, Slavs, Jews, and the Irish. From this perspective of imperial administrators, merchants, planters, and conquistadors, these humans were not human at all. They were regarded as a part of nature, along with the trees and soils and rivers, and treated accordingly. The symbolic, material, and bodily violence of this audacious separation, humanity and nature, performed a special kind of work for the modern world. Backed by imperial power and capitalist rationality, it mobilized the unpaid work of and energy of human, especially women, especially the enslaved, in service to transforming landscapes with a singular purpose, the endless accumulation of capital. So one of Moore's theses, which I am persuaded by, is that we live in a fully capitalist world system here in 2021 where I'm talking, but the system of what we would call capitalism was in place far before the Industrial Revolution, and began with the techniques of colonialism starting out of the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century, and kind of like built on itself with additional tools and technologies up until modern day. But some of those tools were already there. And a lot of these tools were not just kind of technologies, but ways of thinking about the world, ways of mapping, um, and some of it was shipbuilding, and a lot of it was thinking about who was worthy of being called a human and not, and also creating a system of value so that you could actually um, measure the outcomes of the system. And so these tools were already starting to be developed in the 15th centuries. Um, and why this is important, in class number one, Femi Taiwo kind of quipped that for him, he's always going back to 1492, and people are giving him grief about that. But I think it's an important starting point for thinking about global capitalism and kind of what that history has wrought. I think it's important for thinking about climate change. I think it's important for thinking about what we might want as a future society that doesn't rely on abusing different sorts of humans and non-human nature. It's also important because there are stories now about how we got to where we are in this stage of climate catastrophe and climate emergency. And some of those stories distribute the responsibilities for this harm really broadly across society. And some of those stories can narrow the classes and types of people who are most responsible, and then basically ask those people to give more in terms of fixing the problem. And so one of those stories is the Anthropocene, which is a kind of emerged as like a concept in geology for thinking about humans as a kind of like big natural determining force. And but it's translated into a social concept, and a lot of people in the climate world, including maybe a lot of people watching this, will be familiar with the idea of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene, anthropos, right, is human broadly speaking, man broadly speaking. Sort of, I think, inherently applies responsibility to humankind as a whole for a lot of the damages associated with the last, especially 600 years. On the other hand, you can think about this as the Capitalocene. It's another theory about how things have developed and who's responsible. And I'll read this quote from Moore. For the Capitalocene, age of capital is not an argument about replacing one word with another. The Capitalocene argument says three things that the Anthropocene perspective does and cannot. First, insist that the history of capitalism is a relation of capital, power, and nature as an organic whole. It is world ecological. It is a multi-species affair. Capitalism is neither a purely economic nor social system, but a historically situated complex of metabolisms and assemblages. Second, the history of capitalism cannot be reduced to the burning of fossil fuels in England or anywhere else. It is a history of the relations of power and reproduction premised on the cash nexus. Those relations enfolded coal and other energy sources from the 16th century. They allowed for successive waves of global conquest and the worldwide appropriations of cheap nature. Third, the Capitalocene argument challenges the Eurocentric and frankly false view of capitalism as emerging in England during the 18th century. So the Anthropocene argument can basically distance certain people and classes from the effects of colonialism and kind of like limit its responsibility to the last couple hundred years. It starts with England. And so Um, yeah, for me, I prefer the Capitalocene framework of things. I think it clarifies where political strategy needs to be aimed. It politicizes the issue in a way that concept like the Anthropocene just doesn't. Anthropocene sort of like creates a big abstraction, whereas Capitalocene sort of like starts, for me, gets me asking about the producers, who owns the means of production, who are people who are doing labor, who are the people, and where is the nature that's currently being undervalued, in the language of Moore, who are the people that are being exploited, where is the non-human nature that's being appropriated. And then we can begin to, once we sort of crystallize that, then we can begin to ask questions about how we might do things differently. So for me, Capitalocene is not only just a way of conceiving, but it's a way of conceiving that is useful. It creates understanding that then I can turn and think strategically about. So I prefer it for that reason. And ideas I prefer for that reason. I don't like abstractions that stop me from thinking about action. So to give a little bit of a way how this is applied, or why I think this is kind of true, or maybe like a stat that supports the Capitalocene thesis. Here's an article from The Guardian that was published in 2017. It says just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions, the study says. And so, the emitters have names and addresses, they have supply chains, they have investors, rather than kind of all of us being sort of a part of this and all responsible because we consume things that are made by fossil fuels or whatever. It actually gets us closer to thinking about the systems of power and domination that underlie the system that we live under. And of course, the fossil fuel regime that we currently live under didn't arise out of nowhere. There's specific moments in time where identifiable actors are making choices, where different industries are making choices. There are moves to take places that have cheap oil by people that have the guns and might to do so. There are regimes of industrialization. There are stories about why that makes sense and certain people who have them. As I was preparing for this lecture, I was reading around the end of World War II and the kind of rise of the post-World War II economy, where the United States emerged as a relatively unscathed industrial power with a lot of other countries, including the British Empire, which was the sort of like dominant, prior dominant force of global capital before the Americans were collapsed. The competitors in the German Empire were dead, and their leaders being put on trial for crimes against humanity. And the United States emerged as kind of like the sole superpower, and the USSR as well as there. But there are moments where, like, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is meeting with the King of Saudi Arabia on a cruiser, in the Arabian Peninsula, and they're talking about how the United States and Saudi Arabia are going to enter into a geopolitical arrangement to ensure the success of the Saudi monarchy and the flow of cheap oil into the United States. Like, these things have dates and moments in time, geopolitical decisions, strategies. For a more modern example, we could think about the wars in Iraq, both the first one under George Bush Sr. and then the second one as George W. Bush, as moments where the United States sort of exercised that power and control over oil resources in a very overt way, but many other ways in which the American empire has been used in order to, and the American military or intelligence apparatuses have been used in order to secure resources. So it's not just an accident, right? Like, there are people that benefit, their strategies as well. And so it's not just like Joe Schmo American who drives a Humvee or whatever is not as responsible for climate change as the Dulles brothers or FDR or oil companies like the Rockefellers, et cetera, et cetera. And this is something that I think it's really important to understand the functions of capitalism for making choices about a politics that we might want to choose to either augment or replace it. The modern form of capitalism since the 1970s is in literature, political science called neoliberalism. This form of capitalism that we currently live under is one where economy is largely financialized. The power of states and international institutions is massively reduced, or at least some international institutions like the United Nations, other international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, et cetera, were created specifically to expand the power of finance capital, remove barriers to trade, which allows capital to circulate more freely and accumulate into smaller and smaller hands more readily, allowed capital to, build factories and seek resources in countries with lower labor protections and human rights protections and environmental standards, et cetera, because those were the places where a bigger buck could be made. It also coincided with revolution in communications technologies that allowed a company or a small group of people to be able to manage supply chains and integrate them across a really broad area of the world in ways, in real time, in ways that weren't available prior. So for example, you go to the store and you buy a carton of milk or something at Walmart, and the scanner that you're that goes beep, when you're going through the scan out, is already communicating to the supply chain in an automated way about what needs to be made where, right? So these things are like highly integrated now in 2021, technologically integrated, but they're technologies that allow for a specific form of financial capitalism to emerge. I think also when we talk about inequality and justice, injustice, so to think about how these same institutions have been really instrumental in taking resources essentially through forced loan programs. And there's some books, that I read in the 2000s that helped me to start understanding this, like Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine and Confessions of an Economic Hitman, talking about how, usually American-run international institutions or American responsive or Western capital responsive institutions entered into these kind of financial arrangements with developing countries around infrastructure investments, lending way too much than could be returned on a successful infrastructure project, and then using that debt then as a way to get access to natural resources for multinational corporations, usually headquartered in the United States or Europe, to then dominate and then get that sort of non-human nature for cheap or free to maximize profits. So this is it's a system, it's an old system. The tools and techniques may have changed, but the sort of rudiments of this are really similar. I would also say that, when we talk about neoliberalism and the financialized economy that we have now, according to Moore and thinkers like Giovanni Arrighi, this isn't actually like a new thing. This is something that happens in the cycles of capitalism. It's happened at least 4 times in the history of capitalism. Once with kind of like Spain and Genoese bankers entering into a cycle of accumulation that started to bottom out, and then you have the Dutch picking up next on that, and then you have the British, and then now the Americans. And according to Moore and Arrighi, this is something that you had sort of initially in what's called an industrial or like a real economy of expansion, and then as that surplus began to decline because the costs of getting resources started to go up, or labor battles drove the cost of labor up, or the sort of like theft of land and resources turned into more like a management and wage system in some places, the costs kept going up, and so not making as much profit, and so investors want to go somewhere else. So according to them, this is a cycle that is not uncommon, and so in a lot of ways the United States is the American global capitalist economy mimics future or past cycles of accumulation in interesting ways. So how do we see this effect taking place now? What's going on with the economy? Basically, in the world that I work in fossil fuels, and in climate world, we had an era where a lot of industry and trade and accumulation was kind of buttressed on this availability of cheap fossil energy, first in terms of coal and then oil. And most of that easy to economically access energy is gone. It's been used up. And the costs of getting more of that continue to rise, both because of energy, time, labor invested, competition, markets, et cetera. The costs continue to rise. So even, last March, I'm speaking here in February 2021, in March of last year in 2020, the oil economy nearly collapsed entirely, partially due to the pandemic and people not using oil anymore. But even before then, the oil and gas industry was not in a great position. They basically, their costs of production are, their profit margins are continuing to fall. It's reflected in the markets. And it's something that, mass subsidies are basically keeping from that being seen in the marketplace right now. But that's the starting change, is starting to be recognized by broader parts of the market, and people are actually maybe going to start making a move away from fossil energy, hopefully somewhat because of climate change and the effects of that people are actually starting to understand that there's a need for common survival, but also probably just because of costs, are starting to drive that as well. And you see that in places like the Financial Times, which I am not a normal reader of, I confess, very right wing. Also, it's usually paywalled. So this article here, how the race for renewable energy is reshaping the global politics, is now paywalled. Sorry about that. But I was able to read it somehow before it was paywalled. Really interesting article from the finance side of things, thinking about how different countries are going to pursue renewables agendas and non-fossil agendas, and how that's going to change global dynamics around power. They kind of present it in a utopian way, with us, there won't be any conflict anymore when there's no need for, fights over fossil energy. And I'm kind of suspicious of that Pollyanna attitude, especially as freshwater declines. So there's probably plenty of things for people to fight about. But nevertheless, really insightful viewpoint from the folks that are on the investment side of things. So I'll read a quote. But as the energy system changes, so will energy politics. For most of the past century, geopolitical power was intimately connected to fossil fuels. The fear of an oil embargo or gas shortage was enough to forge alliances or start wars, and access to oil deposits conferred great wealth. In the world of clean energy, a new set of winners and losers will emerge. Some see it as a clean energy space race. Countries or regions that master clean technology, export green energy, or import less fossil fuels stand to gain from the new system, while those that rely on exporting fossil fuels, such as the Middle East or Russia, could see their power decline. Here's a similar article that came out in Quartz just a few days ago that suggested that as economies start to retool and promote renewables or climate-friendly industries, that petrostates are going to take a huge hit, which makes a lot of sense. Nobody's buying the fossil fuels anymore, then money is not coming in the door. And they mapped out different countries that were likely to feel this the most and kind of put them on a vulnerability scale. And so you can take a closer look at this article. I thought it was interesting. I'm not going to analyze it, but just point it out as a place to look for how people are thinking about how the economy might retool. You've got Europe that's envisioning a green European deal, a European Green Deal, and is now starting to put money into that. So a big carbon drawdown, at least $1 trillion invested, probably will take more. For folks that follow this closely, they will point out that the deal isn't as green as it was originally advanced. There was a lot of negotiating to make sure that gas got some subsidies as well, which is a big fight that we have in the Pacific Northwest and throughout the US as well. But nevertheless, it still signals a big shift in market dynamics. Europe, I think, buys 20% of the world's fossil fuels right now. And if they make a big transition off of that, of course, that's going to have massive effects on global fossil economy. Similarly, in the United States, you've got, I mean, and more significantly, I would say, than in Europe, you've got the new Biden administration, at least now, making a lot of overtures to the idea that we're going to be pushing to retool the economy away from fossil energy in a really rapid way. I don't think we've seen the full expression of what this policy agenda is going to look like. And also that we live in the US, so like who knows what kind of stumbling blocks this will run into when anything has to go before Congress. But at least right now, Biden administration is signaling that they want to end fossil subsidies, which, you know, depending on what you count as a fossil subsidy, could be in the many hundreds of billions of dollars. It's very significant, especially in an era where a lot of people that work within renewables and green building industries will say that if you eliminate subsidies, you know, renewables can compete at costs with a lot of fossil energy right now. And so like a purely sort of market competition between those energy sources favors renewables right now. That's the idea. And, you know, Grist wrote this article about some of the complications around making these promises and stuff. So let's be realistic about there is a politics at play there. And there's no such thing as a free market that doesn't have kind of government setting the rules, enforcing contracts and all the rest. So, but still big deal that, you know, the United States, the kind of guarantor of world fossil capital, is starting to move away from that. Is a big signal to the rest of the world. US is still, I think, the #1 oil and gas producer in the world. It's a big deal. So kind of returning to more for a second here, I'm trying to contextualize this and pivoting back to capitalism as like a broad idea and system. You know, in order for capitalist economy to function, it needs to basically accumulate endlessly, and the returns have to grow consistently for investors to be happy. And according to Moore, I think this is maybe Moore's biggest insight into this world. Basically, this has to do with theft and exploitation and appropriation. Like that's where the value in a capitalist system comes from. So, you know, you can't just generate value without taking it from one place and going to another. The alchemy of capitalism, in the circuit of capitalism that we measure in what Moore and Marx called abstract social labor, is something that, you know, still has to have all these other elements outside of that measure of value for the system to function. So I'm going to read this quote and then go into a little more detail. So, human work within a porous sphere of commodity production exchange, called the economy, was to be valued. All other activity was devalued, appropriated and serving to advancing labor productivity in a narrow zone of commodification. It marked the origins of cheap nature as an accumulation strategy. But cheap is not free. By cheap, I underscore how capitalism appropriates work and energy and biophysical utility produced with minimal labor power and directly implicated in commodity production and exchange. Cheap natures affect the revival of world accumulation by reducing the value composition of one or more of the big four inputs: labor, food, energy, and raw materials, below the system-wide average. In doing so, they reduce the cost of production for the system as a whole. Thus, cheap timber in the 17th century or oil in the 20th century reduced not only the value of circulating capital, but of commodity in general. So, you know, we're thinking about a Green New Deal in the capitalist sense of things. Let's say that we're considering that as like a new cycle of capitalist accumulation. The question under this framework would be, what's the frontier? Like, where are you going to get cheap food from? Where are you going to get these cheap raw materials? Where are you going to get this cheap energy? You know, maybe the electrons come a little bit cheaper once that infrastructure is in place. You've got your solar and maybe in the future like hydrogen, or, you know, who knows whatever else we're going to use for energy production that we count as renewables. But labor costs are still high. And, you know, if we're only producing in place with lowest labor standards, and that's not going to be that just. Food costs continue to rise, especially as we've depleted a lot of our soils through past agricultural revolutions and overusing them and not actually going through the correct processes of remediating the soil. So we've got food costs continue to rise. Raw materials probably aren't going to get any cheaper because we, just like with cheap energy, easy to access sources of raw material, especially those that may be used in the production of solar panels or circuits and other things that you need for electricity powered economy. You have to get them from somewhere, and you have to spend money in order to get them out. And so those processes are likely not going to get any cheaper. So from the standpoint of like a analysis by someone like Moore, it's a bit of a dangerous time here. Like as things are retooling, you have to think of where, at least what do financiers think that is going to happen on a system-wide scale here. And it has me a little bit scared because I'm not sure. And in some ways you see this play out among kind of like tech entrepreneurs in sort of a weird, they see the frontier, they actually talk about a frontier still, and they call it space basically. And like Elon Musk and Bezos and these other people, these are weirdos, want to get, they see like an asteroid going by and they'll be like, oh, there's enough rare earth minerals and precious metals in this asteroid for like $1 gazillion or whatever. So they're honest in their assessment that they like need cheaper free stuff for this system of accumulation to work. I think others really haven't, at least they're not forecasting how they imagine system-wide costs to reduce. Anyway, it's just food for thought here. In the ways in which for capitalist accumulation to work, you basically have to find cheap or free nature. And there's still, even in a globalized capitalist world, not everything is formally within the circuit of capital. And you've got a lot of slave and near slave labor. You've got a lot of enclosures of natural resources. You've got a lot of created ways of dispossessing people that's kind of not on the books formally. So a lot of people that you don't account for that you're still making value off of. And the number one example of that probably is with women's labor, reproductive labor, and how capitalism since 500 years has pretty much refused to value labor that happens within the household, which is important for reproducing a family and society. It's just sort of not compensated, right? It's just not considered to be valuable because it's a certain way. There's still work happening. The system is still benefiting off of that. Without that type of labor, capitalism probably couldn't work. So there are other systems like that still kind of exist and sustain this. So anyway, that's always a danger in thinking about dynamics within narrow viewpoints of value that the capitalist way of seeing the world helps us to do. So we need to broaden our analysis when we think about justice, especially. And then another quote here that's related. These patterns of environment making have turned upon a new kind of geographical expansion. For capitalism, it's possible to understand as a closed system. The endless accumulation of capital is the endless internalization of nature. Capitalism is defined by frontier movement. The very dynamism of capitalist production is unthinkable in the absence of frontier appropriations that allowed more and more materials to flow through a given unit of abstract labor time. Value's self-expanding character depends on an exponential rise in the material volume of production, but without a corresponding rise in the abstract labor implied in such production. This incessant reduction of labor time can only occur to the extent that the four chiefs, meaning labor, food, energy, and raw materials, can be secured through appropriation. This requires the continual enlargement of the geographical arenas for such appropriations. So without getting things for cheap or free, there's really no way to sustain this moving forward. Got a slide later that basically says, like, if capitalism is about basically getting things for cheap or free, that's where the value comes from. And if you turn that off, then that system doesn't function anymore. It can't accumulate endlessly. So yeah, I would recommend to folks who are really interested in this, reading some of Moore's work. Capitalism and the Web of Life is phenomenal, in my opinion. Published in 2015. It is I'll show you a picture of what it looks like. It's a published by Verso. It's pretty dense, takes a little bit to work through, but really nice. And then there's, I came to more through this book, which is a collection of essays called Anthropocene or Capitalocene, also really nice. And then he's got a bunch of stuff that he just puts up on his website in academia.edu that you can get for free. So my suggestion is if you're interested in this way of thinking about things, maybe read some more of his stuff. I think he does a really interesting way of storytelling the rise of kind of colonialism and the Dutch Empire and kind of the ways in which those empires got human labor and nature for cheap or free. And those are the reasons that they were able to thrive for the time periods that they did. Okay, so kind of wrapping this up, and hopefully this serves as like a big part of the framework that follows up on Femi's talk about racial capitalism and what Theo will talk about next week with extractive frontiers, petrostates, etc. These are questions that I'm not necessarily answering right now, but asking and wanting other people in this class and who are just following along with these topics to learn more about. So what are the frontiers and resources that capitalism will attempt to capture for cheap or free for the next cycle of accumulation? Or is the present crisis of capital accumulation a terminal crisis? Meaning, is there no more free stuff to be had? And if so, what does that mean? I think, the pandemic has asked a lot of questions about the future of capitalism because the economy took such a huge hit. And in particular, the American Federal Reserve has just served as insurer of last resort, not only for banks like it did in the 2008-2009 financial crisis, but across industry as a whole. I mentioned before that the fossil fuel industry was bailed out, but there are a lot of sectors of the economy that basically the Federal Reserve is just taking their losses on its books and insuring them. And who knows what that means? We might be in right now like a major shift in the global economy, either to another cycle of accumulation or something else. So like getting a handle on that, I think, is important right now, especially for people that want to see a just world that's going to avoid climate collapse. And to the next question, how will that affect human rights, international justice, and the integrity of ecosystems and species, depending on which way we go? For me, what international institutions already exist that are capable of moderating the potential impacts of a future capitalist accumulation cycle, or serving as a template for something better that promotes justice far better than capitalism ever could? And four, what sorts of institutions do we need to build to achieve human rights, international justice, intergenerational justice, and build better relationship between humanity and non-human nature? And then the kind of political question is, what is to be done? Like, how do we do that? So these are just some questions that I ask myself right now and often, and I hope we return to in the class. And then we'll kind of wind things down for the day after I take a drink of tea by thinking about some alternative institutions and frameworks that we can look for inspiration right now. And looking forward, we've got a class on Green New Deal economics coming up here pretty soon with my colleague Mitch Green, who's a really awesome economist and thinker around jobs guarantee and Green New Deal. He's also a modern monetary theorist, and so he'll tell you a little bit about that when the time comes. But kind of as we wait for that, some of these things are economic. I'm not an economist, so I'm going to wait till we have some of our professionals talk about that. But just in terms of kind of structures, and maybe let's even think of them as kind of transitional institutions and legal instruments, things that can work with the system as it is. They're not revolutionary in that they immediately kind of like call for the abolition of private property or something like that, but they have different natures that can work within a system of private property, for example. And I'll tell you what I mean with that about a sec. But first, I think as a institution or a strategy, reparations has to be at the top of the list. Historical reparations for colonialism, slavery, and other injustices, but also, countries that are suffering brutally from changing climate, that haven't been a part of the cause. So in the Western European and Europe and the United States especially, bear a lot of that burden, and a lot of accumulation has come into the hands of investors from past cycles of accumulation based on acquiring cheap fossil energy and burning it in certain parts of the world. And so I think reparations are really important for any thinking about justice. Also, a lot of like international debt and countries that are in debt to the West in a lot of ways. A lot of geopolitics are framed that way. Debt forgiveness as a part of reparations could be a big part of allowing for different transitions to happen. The promotion of the commons, I think, is an important thing to do. The history of capitalism is one of the enclosure of historical commons, and those being, in Europe at least, sort of feudal areas that were co-managed, overseen by a lord, but not private property as we would understand it. And so serfs had sort of like more control over property, and you didn't have a lot of like fencing in Europe. And so the enclosures of commons were taking those commonly used areas and then turning them into fenced private areas that had property relations around them, and sort of limiting that free use of terrain and resources. And there are movements now to kind of like common things, commoning being the verb, but intentionally decommodifying, currently privatized spaces. And that can look a lot of different ways. It can be, you can just do it in a city or a state, can just declare areas not privatized anymore. That's the thing you can do. And in a thoroughly neoliberal world, that almost seems like a revolutionary thing to say, but you can do it. I see it often in legal work. And you can just sort of like declare them to be not managed for private gain. It moves against the impulses of states because they want to generate economic activity in their jurisdictions, and they get some tax revenue from doing that as well. And so they have incentives, and those institutions generally designed to promote and facilitate that, but they have the capacity to decommodify spaces and to create commons. In Europe, there are a lot of cities that are doing commons mapping and like seeking to protect those commons and keep them from being privatized by like tourist industries and things like that. And so there are major efforts happening. And then I know less about it in the world of conservation, but I know that there is a lot of thinking about promoting common spaces, traditionally managed common spaces in ways that promote local uses and regional uses, and don't just kind of like as a alternative to, using the international market to price land or carbon offsets and things like that, which may protect certain kinds of functions, like an ability of an area to sequester carbon, but it might also like eject indigenous peoples or local peoples from like using an area that they used to use for resources. Marx wrote about how in Germany, forest spaces were being enclosed and peasants were being punished for taking wood, right? Like this is an old story in the history of capitalism, is kind of like taking spaces and holding them and kicking off poor people basically from using those resources. So a commons would be intentionally designed and managed with far more democratic input to benefit more people, usually in a local or regional area. And I hope we talk more about this as the class goes on. Trusts are things that I've worked with in the past. I used to work for an organization called our Children's Trust, as did many of my breach colleagues. And my mentor in law school is a woman named Mary Wood, I think I'm talking about tonight, who promoted an idea of like a public trust and sort of like trying to push states to treat the atmosphere and resources as a private trust we managed, so that you have like a trustee who manages the trust according to certain principles, and then um, there'd be an enforceable duty that came with that. So, maybe it's a scientific mandate to not allow emissions to rise or something like that. You could use that in a variety of ways. So far, that hasn't really worked as a litigation strategy, at least in Oregon and a lot of other places. Courts have outright rejected that analogy. But you could just pass laws that declared the same. You don't need it to go through the courts as a lawsuit. So you can maybe create an analog to a trust over natural resources or public resources and create a public trust. There are also private trusts, like for housing and for land, that are already used widely. And so I live in Oregon, and I can look up. Uh, there's like an association of land trusts where it will point to you all of the land trusts that exist already. And I used to be on the board of the Klamath Lake Land Trust. I'm from Klamath Falls, Oregon originally. And that trust is kind of newer, but it's acquiring a bunch of land. And basically a land trust can hold a bunch of land. We have a state mandate that allows those institutions to do that. And then they kind of hold them tax-free, and they can hold them with a conservation purpose, right? And I think that you could expand those purposes. I think that there's a lot of possibilities where land trusts could work really closely with tribes and tribal people, and thinking about how you could manage land sort of in tandem. Maybe you couldn't just transfer property straight over to tribes because they have to go through a Bureau of Indian Affairs process in order to take land back. But you could still establish kind of like common principles and enter into agreements where land is, still formally held in a property arrangement, but, kind of like getting closer to what you would think of as maybe like a decolonized in terms of its use. And so that's a way of maybe getting us closer to a transitional state to actually having formally decolonized or land back type processes. And I'm happy to talk to folks about that more if there's ever any questions. I found that to be an interesting area. I did a ton of research around what it actually takes for a tribe to be able to like take land and put it back on their rolls. And so that's something I'd be willing to talk to anybody about at any time. There's also these frameworks around rights of nature that can be really interesting. Kind of a declaration of rights it's a Western concept. So it may not, although, kind of oddly, maybe not oddly, in sort of places that are trying to become post-colonial, like places in South America and Ecuador, which Thea Riofrancos will have a lot to say about next week. I'm not an expert, so she might correct me even on some of this, but in their constitution, they have kind of rights of nature as a North Star. And there have been some cases in different parts of the world where people or institutions have tried to assign rights to like a river basin and then litigate those. This is a way of thinking that can also work with existing law. You just create a fictional person that sort of serves as the agent of whatever this entity in nature that you're creating, and then you would, as you declare your right, then you would have some kind of like a management scheme that attached to that right, and in order to manage it. So a right that has kind of an implementation strategy can be a tool that's potentially useful. I know that there are some tribes in the Klamath River Basin, again, sort of where I'm from, that have declared that the Klamath River has rights. And who knows, maybe there's, through like the Klamath River Intertribal Fish Commission, there's a way of sort of instituting rights that can then push back on some of the incursions on those rights from agriculture or timber and other things. I'm waiting to see how that could be done. There's potentially ways of using existing treaty rights in order to do that, although I know tribes are, and understandably, loath to try to use treaty rights in a really radical way because they could lose them. But there are legal instruments that maybe are not revolutionary, but they kind of get us closer to the types of relationships that we might think about to land and to labor that are currently, a vast minority of how those are used.
Did I kick you out?
Yeah. Hold on. Had a brief shift of rooms, sharing Zoom life. So anyway, just kind of winding this down. I think there are some transitional institutions. That was definitely not you know, a total list. And I think as we bring in really smart economic thinkers, there'll be different ways of thinking about like financing and funding and alternative institutions of finance, public banking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that answer some of the questions about how we mobilize the resources to be able to do some of the productive style building of new energy systems and things like that, but that don't just rely on private capital, may actually like retain that infrastructure for the public, broadly speaking, moving forward. But you know, I think in order to think those frameworks into existence and to build them, we need to really understand what capitalism is, what it requires, and pretty much like why we don't want it to be the centerpiece of a Green New Deal or a just transition. And so, just as we wrap up, I wanted to read one more quote from Moore. This is the secret of capital accumulation: to capitalize the oikos so as to enable more expansive appropriations of nature, but that only works if there are big frontiers somewhere out there. Thus, calls for capital to pay for the true costs of resource use, an impossibility, since no metric can capture the differentiated activity of the web of life, are to be welcomed, because such calls directly contradict capital's fundamental logic. To call for capital to pay its own way is to call for the abolition of capitalism.